To the elders of Massachusetts, Frank symbolized the fact that you can have a bit of empowerment, that you can speak out on your own behalf, that you do not have to just sit back and let others tell you how to lead your life. And it meant a lot to them. He was everybody's hero.
He was absolutely brilliant. A great memory for facts, a great memory for issues, and he was very persuasive. Personally, he was not particularly tall. He was rather soft-spoken. With a microphone in his hands, he was deadly.
Frank could be the best stand-up comedian. He had such a sense of humor. And his timing was just astounding. I mean, he could tell a joke that was so old and so corny, and yet he would have people laughing. And sometimes we were actually rolling on the floor.
It was almost a cult of personality because he had such charisma and such force that he was so totally identified with the movement that it was hard to think of elder activism without thinking of Frank Manning.
But he wasn't one of those who said, hey, I don't care about you if you're 10 or 20 or if you're handicapped or if you have this other problem. Manning really was a genuinely compassionate man who believed in society dealing with the needs of a whole range of people.
He could call more people by names. He had a faculty for remembering names. And he would move through the audience and he'd say, oh, from Ludenberg, I remember you. Oh, from Gardner, I remember you. How's everything up in Ashby? And he was a master of that. He had all the abilities of a leader.
Frank Manning was one of the few people, all during the 70s and the early 80s, that was there to remind us of what our responsibility was to our fellow men and women. And he never wavered for one instant. Never wavered for one instant. Frank was the guy that, probably above anybody else in the state, was, in a real sense, our conscience.
In 1967, Frank Manning's life suddenly seemed empty. At age 65, Manning was a retired union organizer, a bachelor of simple means, looking for something to do with his time. On a whim, Manning stopped in at a Golden Age club not far from his rooming house in Allston, Massachusetts. What he saw would change the direction of his life.
What he found was people playing bingo and making ceramics, and that was certainly not Frank. And he felt that was sort of like kindergarten for older people, and he thought that was really ridiculous, and that older people had much more to offer and much more to give back to society than making ceramics in a little senior club.
The idea of old people was to give them a little bus trip to the beach, to the movies or some other place, wherever they go. That wasn't what their needs were. There's a lot of people who need to go out and have some fun. For the most part, he recognized they needed income and housing and health services, the important things in life.
Manning set into action. He gathered together a handful of people with the hope of forming a political action group for senior citizens. They decided to call it LCOA, the Legislative Council of Older Americans.
And so the subject came of money, and we didn't have any money. So what we did was pass around a hat. We collected $50, and that was the launching of LCOA.
Frank Manning's goal was to influence legislation, but to sway legislators, he needed a constituency. In a call to action, he traveled the state, pleading with over 500 Golden Age clubs to join his crusade for elderly rights. Manning's recruitment efforts were bearing fruit, and his political coalition of seniors was growing. But at the State House, Manning found a less receptive audience.
People really didn't take him seriously. Nobody really believed him. Nobody paid a lot of attention. They may have given him a little lip service, but not really taken him very seriously or spent much time focusing on some of the issues that he was presenting. and that was very discouraging.
But Frank Manning did not give up easily. Instead, he sounded the call for a massive rally to take place at the Suffolk Downs racetrack in East Boston. Through promises of an immense turnout of senior citizens from all over the state, Manning coaxed top politicians to attend the event. Senator Kennedy and Governor Sargent headed the list. Now Manning had to deliver on his promise.
And I can remember he and Frank Oliver coming in and saying, "What do you think?" I said, "I don't know how you're going to do it." You know, it says, what are you going to do? We'll have it in the morning and they're going to stay around for the races? You know, I had my qualms about it.
And Frank Manning was trying to get senior citizens to come to an out-of-the-way place, a long ways off from Springfield, Mass., long ways off from Worcester, for older persons over the age of 65. And he was going to have a meeting there, and he was asking some of the really important people in Massachusetts to come. It was a dangerous kind of undertaking for him because, hey, you have Suffolk Downs, and if it's empty, how awful.
On the morning of April 23rd, 1971, Frank Manning arrived at an empty Suffolk Downs.
Now, what was strange that day that concerned me a little was that Frank, he came there about an hour earlier or so, and then he told a few of us that he was going off to a room. He wanted to be alone.
He was very nervous, very tense, like a performer before the day of the big play. And he was in a small, dark room at Suffolk Downs, realizing how much he personally had at stake and how much the organization had at stake. A small turnout at the first Suffolk Downs rally could have easily meant, I think, the end of LCOA and MAOA, and it certainly would have been, I think, the end of his career as a major organizer.
As Manning waited in a back room, the grandstand remained almost empty. The event was to begin in a matter of minutes.
And then, almost like a Western, there was a kind of cloud of dust in the distance. Literally, it had been dry, and all of a sudden, there was this endless stream of buses.
And suddenly, I had this overwhelming feeling of a sea of humanity just pouring in from all directions, all excited, all elderly.
You couldn't believe these buses pulling in from Springfield, Williamstown, senior power from Pittsfield, senior power from Springfield, senior power from Holyoke, senior, all over the state.
Some reports say 15,000 people were in attendance. Others say there were 30,000. But when Frank Manning emerged, one thing was clear. He had created the largest state rally of senior citizens in history.
Most of the elders who came to Suffolk Downs were very, very excited, and their enthusiasm seemed to grow larger when they looked at the large numbers around them. And as each speaker went on, the excitement grew because everybody was waiting for Frank. Frank was the last speaker, and everybody was kind of tolerating and listening to the politicians, but they all had come to hear Frank. And when Frank came on, there was just this thunderous roar of approval.
You get up there and at that mic, and boy, he really laid him in the aisle, you know. Great. I mean, we were all charged up.
Manning spoke of the urgent needs of senior citizens: fair housing, health care, home care, and adequate incomes. He told them that together they could make a change, and the audience responded.
People were shaking their canes and their crutches in the air. They were stamping. People in wheelchairs were banging their hands against the side. Tears were running down the eyes of almost everyone there.
They had found a messiah. They had found a leader. They had found a man that was really going to fight for their causes and who had organized them. And that's what that day was all about. It always sticks to my mind. There was a pleasure in the fact that they had found a leader, and that leader was Frank Manning.
Overnight, Frank Manning had become a sensation, and for the first time, senior citizens were being heard. News of the rally traveled across the state and the country. Manning had successfully transformed a previously invisible group into one of the most powerful lobbies in the state. Now he would turn his troops onto the State House in full force. Whether the issue was Social Security or supplemental income, home care or housing, Medicare or mandatory retirement, Manning and his senior citizens would be there.
We would gather at the Arlington Street Church. You know, we'd all get together. And then we'd cross the street, we'd go over to the Common, and Frank would be leading the procession, you know, like the Pied Piper with his bullhorn.
But the strange thing was many of the people were so frail that you never thought they could have gone a block, never mind 6 blocks partially uphill. It showed their strength, and they were very determined to follow Frank on the march. And it also attracted lots of onlookers, people looking, wondering, who were these people, and what were these elders doing?
And it was the kind of thing, of course, that the media loved. Frank was great copy for newspapers. He was great on film, great on television, and these marches, culminating with a cheer, a pep talk from Frank Manning, were always the highlight of a news day.
You can believe the state legislators picked up their ears, as did the congressmen, when they saw this powerful organization. They became the most powerful organization in the state politically.
It was common knowledge that any bill concerning the elderly could not pass through the legislature without Manning's endorsement. Manning's organization strongly influenced the passing of bills like the establishment of the Department of Elderly Affairs, the 10-cent subway fare, the setting up of a home care system, and the abolishment of mandatory retirement.
He was a man who, all the politicians who came to Boston, big ones, good ones, you know, good ones and bad ones, would come to visit him because they knew he controlled a significant vote.
Frank's endorsement was very powerful. Older people vote, they always have voted in large numbers. Frank knew that, candidates knew that. His endorsement gave you credibility. It was like the good housekeeping seal. For city council races, for state legislature, for Congress, for Senate, U.S. Senate, Frank's endorsement meant a lot because it told senior citizens, a legitimate individual with no financial interest in this race and an only concern for your welfare is telling you that this particular candidate is a good person.
For nearly 2 decades, Manning forged relationships with the politicians. In the corridors of the State House, he was the voice for senior citizens. On the outside, Manning ran a thriving organization of volunteers, the Mass Association of Older Americans, providing services to elderly across the state. Manning also helped to create the Gerontology Institute at UMass Boston, a revolutionary program empowering elders to conduct research and to shape public policy.
As I met with Frank and I was telling him, you know, I'm just so amazed at the interest of the students, and many of the faculty are now saying that some of their favorite courses are teaching in the gerontology program, which had students, the average age of a student at the time was about 67 years old, and they were saying how much they enjoyed teaching the older students and how enthusiastic they were about learning and how prepared they came to class and how just energetic they were about the learning experience. And Frank looked at me like I was an idiot. What could be more obvious was sort of his response, was that of course older people are going to be excited and interested in what they're doing. They're going because they really want to learn.
As Manning approached his 80s, he was still fighting for the rights of the elderly every day. But the onset of Parkinson's disease and chronic infections were beginning to take their toll.
During the time that I worked with Frank, it was very difficult for him to maneuver. It was not easy for him to see things well. He could not even hold a pen very easily at times, so that writing was even a problem. He certainly wasn't easy for him to get in and out of a chair. The very basic things that we do all the time presented a problem for Frank.
And from time to time, I'd see him and I'd say, how is he going to survive? He'd be in the hospital, he'd come out, he'd be treated, he'd come out. And then I'd see him again.
Despite his illness, Manning insisted on continuing his fight for the elderly. Frank Manning could barely walk, yet he regularly spoke across the state on behalf of seniors.
And I remember just how difficult it was for him to get to the microphone, and often his voice was so weak. I mean, you could barely hear him, and his voice, just everything was faltering.
We propped him up in front of the mic, and he held on to the mic. And from the moment he started to talk, he was like a changed man. You would never know he was sick. You would never know he couldn't walk. He was just electrifying. The people who were there, the older folks, were just sitting there, glued to their eyes were glued on him. He was just marvelous, marvelous. He got everybody so inspired, and he himself, you could see that he was feeling so good.
On August 25th, 1986, 5 days after his 82nd birthday, Frank Manning passed away. He began by changing his own life from a retired Union man into an active and motivated elder citizen. Then he breathed life into a movement that has transformed the lives of all senior citizens in Massachusetts. For 17 years, Frank Manning nurtured the senior power movement, and in return was sustained by its vitality.